The Arizona sun bore down mercilessly on Luke Air Force Base. Heat rippled across the tarmac, making the polished aluminum of the parked F-16 shimmer like a mirage. Its fuselage, marred by decades of combat and training scars, sat silently, its engines cold, its systems dead. The warning lights blinked mockingly on the cockpit panel, stubborn and unrelenting. Everyone on the crew was aware of the stakes. This wasn't just another maintenance check. It was the day visiting senators were here, evaluating base readiness and documenting delays. A grounded F-16 was an embarrassment no one wanted to shoulder. Ground crews huddled around the jet, manuals in hand, tools scattered across the sun-baked concrete. Sweat gleamed on the foreheads of young airmen, and their hands trembled slightly as they toggled switches, flipped panels, and consulted checklists. "I've tried everything," muttered one, frustration lacing his voice. Another kicked the edge of a toolbox in exasperation, sending wrenches clattering across the tarmac. The lead engineer, a silver-haired man named Sergeant Major Tully, ran his hand through thinning hair. "If we don't get this up in 30 minutes, the senator's inspection report is going to be brutal." A low murmur ran through the gathered personnel as radios crackled with brief updates and conflicting instructions. Nothing worked. Systems refused to reset. The engines, usually snarling with life, remained silent. And then the unexpected happened. A dust-coated pickup truck rumbled past the security gate and eased toward the grounded jet. The vehicle's presence drew only passing glances, until the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He moved slowly but with deliberate precision, like someone whose body remembered motions that had long ceased to be taught. His flight jacket was faded, worn at the elbows. There were no insignias, no current rank tags, nothing to identify him except a quiet confidence that seemed to demand attention. "Who is that?" one of the junior techs whispered, voice barely audible over the buzzing of the portable generators. "Don't know," said another, squinting against the sun. "Looks like retired." The man walked with a rhythm entirely his own, eyes scanning the F-16's fuselage with a sort of reverence usually reserved for living creatures. He knelt, placing a calloused hand gently on the intake, closing his eyes for a brief moment. A shiver ran through the gathered crews. It was as if the jet itself recognized him. "Sir, you can't," one young mechanic started, pointing toward the restricted area. He didn't look up. "I'll need a wrench," he said softly. Just a simple request, almost casual, but with a weight that made every maintenance worker freeze. A laugh, nervous and incredulous, broke out from the back of the group. "A civilian thinks he can fix her. After all this, go ahead, Grandpa, knock yourself out." The man ignored them, pulling a small toolkit from his worn jacket. The laughter died instantly when the senior chief's face paled. Recognition spread like a ripple across the tarmac, carried in whispers. Harlan Switch Kane. Legends rarely walked out of retirement, especially ones whose exploits had been buried in classified files and debriefings marked top secret. Switch. He was a name that haunted every pilot who had ever flown an F-16, a man who had survived missions others didn't even know existed. His reputation wasn't built on public heroics. It was built on survival, instinct, and an uncanny ability to fix machines that should have killed their pilots. And right now, he was kneeling beside their grounded jet, calm, collected, and utterly unbothered by the chaos around him. Tully, the lead engineer, hesitated. His instincts screamed protocol. "Sir, you can't just." Kane lifted a hand. The gesture was simple but absolute. "I know what I'm doing, step back." There was a pause. Even the young airman, eager and impatient, felt the room tilt toward silence. Kane's eyes scanned the panel, landing on the cluster of stubborn warning lights. He murmured under his breath, a soft cadence almost musical. "Fuel flow choked. Not a computer issue, never a computer issue." Then he stood, crouched over the intake, and began moving with hands that were both delicate and unyielding. Fingers traced pipes and wires, feeling for bends, obstructions, and misalignments. He worked with precision that defied age, years of muscle memory from decades of high-G maneuvers, emergency landings, and battlefield improvisation. The jet wasn't just a machine to him. It was an extension of the pilots he had flown with, the missions he had lived, the risks he had survived. You know what you're doing," one mechanic asked, still trembling. Kane didn't answer immediately. He hummed softly, almost inaudibly, before replying, "I remember every sound she makes when she's scared." The crew exchanged nervous glances. The senators from their viewing stands leaned forward. They hadn't been briefed on Switch Kane. They didn't know the story of the man who had fixed aircraft in the middle of combat zones, whose hands had saved pilots in ways no report could record. And yet, there he was, kneeling under the sun, fingers blackened with grease and fuel, working in silence. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Every motion Kane made seemed measured, yet almost invisible, so effortless that it felt like the jet itself was responding, leaning into his touch, whispering back through metal and hydraulics. Sweat dripped down his temples, catching in the dust on his skin, but his focus never wavered. A young pilot, hovering anxiously near the edge of the tarmac, whispered to a colleague, Do you think he can actually fix it?" The older pilot shook his head slowly. "I don't think I know. Nobody called him Switch for nothing." Then Kane did something that froze the entire base. He tapped a tiny valve, a part so inconspicuous no manual highlighted it, no standard protocol addressed it. And just like that, the stubborn warning lights blinked once, twice, and then vanished. The F-16 sat silent but alive. A quiet tension filled the air. Kane stepped back, wiping his hands. For a moment, no one dared to speak. The younger mechanics stared in awe. Tully's jaw slackened. The senators blinked in disbelief. Finally, Kane looked up. "She'll start," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "But someone ignored a warning years ago. If I'm right, this isn't over." The implication hung in the scorching Arizona air. Commanders shifted uneasily, realizing that what they were witnessing wasn't just a quick fix. It was history, accountability, and a legacy all converging on a single moment. And as the crowd watched, the man known only as Switch Kane turned, dust rising around his boots, and began walking away, leaving behind a silence so heavy it could have been mistaken for a storm. Because in that moment, no one could deny it. The F-16 had been dead on the tarmac, but the legend who revived it was very, very much alive. And the question everyone whispered, afraid to speak too loudly. What else does he know, and what will he do next? The tarmac was quiet now, except for the low hum of distant engines warming up for training runs. The crowd of technicians, pilots, and base staff lingered in disbelief, still processing what had just occurred. The F-16, previously declared dead, now sat poised like a predator ready to awaken. And all around them, a single name was whispered reverently, almost fearfully: Harlan Switch Kane. Kane didn't immediately respond to the murmurs. He crouched beside the intake again, eyes narrowed as though reading invisible data flowing through the jet's veins. His fingers traced tubing and wiring with a precision that seemed unnatural, like watching someone communicate silently with a living organism. He wasn't following a manual, he was listening, and everyone could feel it. "Sir," a young technician started, voice trembling, how do you know what's wrong? We tried everything. Kane's head tilted slightly, his gray eyes, piercing under the brim of a weathered flight cap, locked on the boy. "I flew this bird," he said quietly, each word deliberate, carrying weight. "I know her quirks. I know the ones that bite." The room collectively inhaled. To hear that out loud, spoken by a man without rank in this setting, was both shocking and intimidating. Even the seasoned officers shifted uneasily, recalling stories that weren't supposed to leave classified briefings. Switch Kane wasn't just a technician or pilot. He was a ghost of the Air Force's past, someone who existed in the rare spaces where failure meant death and survival demanded brilliance. The senior chief, Tully, stepped forward, voice low but firm. "Sir, we need protocols, clearance, Authorization. Kane didn't raise his eyes. Protocols are for when you have the luxury of failure. This bird doesn't have that luxury. His fingers moved again, touching a sensor no one had dared to examine, a component so delicate that mishandling it could trip the system entirely. "See this," he murmured. "Cracked. Missed it by 2 years in inspections. It's a time bomb." Whispers spread across the crew like wildfire. The implications were terrifying. If Kane was right, then this F-16's sudden failure wasn't a fluke. It was a symptom of negligence, a ghost of errors long ignored. A young pilot stepped closer, curiosity and fear warring in his eyes. "Sir, you flew combat in this jet." Kane exhaled sharply. "I flew more than you can imagine. Missions nobody knew about. Tests nobody survived to tell. I left because someone had to. Because someone needed to watch these machines, not just fly them." He paused, gaze drifting to the F-16 as if reading its unspoken history. "And this one nearly killed someone today because people forgot to listen." The senators, who had been silent observers until now, leaned forward, faces a mix of awe and apprehension. No one had briefed them on the legend among them. The entire base seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for Kane to do what only he could. He popped open another panel, revealing the intricacy beneath the F-16's armored shell. No wires were out of place, no connectors disconnected. But he reached deeper behind shielding panels, where systems overlapped in a tangle of mechanical poetry. Every move was precise, measured, informed by decades of instinct. Fingers blackened with grease and sweat-traced valves, switches, and couplings like a surgeon performing a delicate operation in total silence. "Try the engine," Kane said softly. The lead engineer hesitated. "Sir." "Now," Kane snapped, not angrily but with the force of absolute certainty. The crew exchanged nervous glances. They obeyed, holding their collective breath. Engines roared to life, turbines spinning in a perfect cadence, the previously stubborn warning lights vanishing entirely. The F-16's growl reverberated across the tarmac, a song of triumph and danger intertwined. For a moment everyone wanted to cheer, but Kane's sharp intake of breath cut through the elation. "She's alive," he muttered, voice low, "but alive doesn't mean safe. Someone ignored this warning 20 years ago." The weight of that statement sank in. The tension didn't dissipate, it multiplied. Kane's calm confidence was terrifying because it implied knowledge of mistakes buried in the past, mistakes that could still kill. The senior officers stepped closer, questions forming on their lips, but Kane shook his head. "Not now, you don't want to know yet. Later, maybe. Right now, watch and learn." The young pilot who had asked about combat history couldn't contain his curiosity. "Sir, were you on any missions that were classified?" Kane's jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the horizon as if the desert itself held memories. "I was on missions where the world didn't exist for us, and death was the only real enemy. I left flying because I couldn't keep counting the ghosts." The air seemed to thicken with the weight of unspoken stories. The young crew could almost feel the tension of unreported flights, of dangers hidden behind redacted reports, and the life-and-death decisions made without backup or oversight. "Ghosts," whispered one technician. "Yes," Kane replied almost to himself. "And this one," he said, patting the side of the jet, "was one of the hardest. She doesn't forget." He stood upright, slowly, deliberately. The sun caught the silver strands in his hair, highlighting the lines of a life hardened by experience, sacrifice, and knowledge that couldn't be taught. He turned to face the group, voice steady but carrying the undeniable weight of authority. "You're looking at the difference between a machine and a weapon, between a jet that can kill and a jet that protects. That difference is the pilot, and the one who listens." The words hung in the air. Some of the younger airmen didn't fully grasp the meaning, but fear and respect intertwined in a visceral understanding. Kane had fixed the F-16, yes, but he had also reminded them of something much bigger, something about vigilance, history, and the consequences of ignoring warnings. One of the senators finally spoke, voice wavering. "Sir, you." Kane held up a hand. "I'm not here for accolades. I'm here because if you don't fix the root, you'll keep making the same mistakes. I've seen what happens when pride, paperwork, and politics outweigh common sense." There was a pause. Nobody moved. The air hummed with tension as the F-16 idled, ready to soar, while its history and the ghosts of past errors lingered heavily above the tarmac. Then Kane bent forward, fingers once again skimming across the cockpit panel. "The engine is stable, but one of the backup systems wasn't logged in the report. Someone flagged it and ignored it. That's what nearly killed you today." The room went cold. The weight of decades of negligence pressed down like the desert sun, unrelenting. Everyone knew what he meant. The errors weren't just technical, they were human. Pride, oversight, bureaucracy. And somewhere in the chain, someone had survived without accountability. Until now. Kane looked up, eyes meeting the gaze of every officer and technician on the tarmac. "Remember this moment. It isn't just about a jet. It's about listening, about paying attention, about respecting what's alive in front of you. You ignore that and one day it won't come back alive." No one spoke. Even the senators were silent, scribbling furiously on notes but unsure if they had witnessed a miracle, a warning, or a reckoning. Kane stepped back, tools in hand, and gave a slight nod. The youngest mechanic whispered again, barely audible, "That's Switch Kane." The air shifted. Everyone felt it. The presence of someone who had transcended titles and authority, who could touch machines, read warnings like open books, and survive where others failed. A legend had walked the tarmac, revived a grounded F-16, and left behind a lesson that would haunt everyone present. And then Kane turned toward the edge of the runway, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The engines thrummed quietly behind him, alive and breathing. He didn't run, didn't boast. He simply walked, leaving behind a storm of questions that no one dared voice. What else does he know? How many more jets are hiding mistakes like this? And if he's returned once, will he have to return again? The whispers followed him like shadows. Switch Kane. The legend, alive and unfazed, had changed everything in one quiet, unassuming moment. The roar of the F-16's engine slowly faded into the Arizona morning, leaving a thick silence behind. The ground crew, still absorbing the shock of what had just happened, remained frozen. Not one of them dared move. They weren't watching a man fix a jet. They were watching a living legend perform what felt like impossible magic. Kane didn't smile. He crouched beside the aircraft again, fingers hovering over the panels, eyes narrowing as if detecting the pulse of metal and hydraulics beneath his fingertips. He wasn't finished. The engine's hum was steady, but the aircraft wasn't entirely safe. Kane's instincts had always been sharper than instruments, and he could hear the warning lurking beneath the surface. "Power cycle," Kane instructed softly, voice low and commanding. "Once." The words sounded innocent, almost casual, but every engineer in the hangar froze. Power cycles weren't unusual, but Kane's tone implied something more profound. Hesitation flickered on Tully's face. The senior chief knew Kane's reputation well enough to understand that hesitation could be dangerous. "Sir, are you sure?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "I'm sure," Kane replied. "I don't need diagnostics, I need trust." It was the kind of command that could silence even the most argumentative officer. With slow, deliberate movements, the crew obeyed. A low, tense rumble spread through the jet as systems rebooted in sequence. Lights flickered, switches reset themselves, and warning indicators began to recalibrate. The F-16's growl shifted slightly, deeper and more confident, a heartbeat that only Kane could interpret. "Look here," he said, tracing a line of tubing with fingers blackened from fuel and dirt. "This valve, untouched for years. They considered it minor. I remember the flight test when it almost killed me. Nobody logged it." A young mechanic stepped closer, pale and anxious. "Sir, is that dangerous?" Kane exhaled sharply, hands resting on his knees. Dangerous, it's deadly if ignored, that's why I left flying, because pride and politics nearly got people killed. His voice was steady but cold, a quiet threat and a lesson all in one. I know this jet, I know its secrets, and I know what's been overlooked. He reached deeper into the maintenance bay, moving past protective panels and wiring bundles like a man tracing veins in a body. Sweat traced lines down his temples, but he moved with precision, each motion deliberate, informed by decades of muscle memory honed in extreme combat situations. Every time he touched a valve, flipped a switch, or adjusted a connection, it was a conversation with history itself. "Sir, how can you remember all of this?" a technician asked, voice trembling. Kane didn't answer immediately. He hummed softly, almost inaudibly, counting under his breath. "I remember every sound she makes when she's scared," he finally replied. His gray eyes scanned the aircraft, sharp and calculating. "Every vibration, every hesitation, every error, this is how I survive." Time seemed to slow as Kane worked. The younger mechanics watched in awe, unsure whether to intervene or stand back. Sweat soaked their uniforms, dust coated their skin, and the heat of the tarmac pressed down, but none dared break the rhythm. Kane was beyond authority, beyond instruction. He was instinct incarnate. Then, without warning, he reached a hand deep into a panel no one had dared touch. A tiny valve, overlooked, forgotten, almost irrelevant in the manuals, was the linchpin. He swapped it out, adjusting it by feel alone. "Try now," Kane said. The lead engineer hesitated but nodded. Systems hummed, the engine roared to life, and warning lights vanished once more. Relief surged, but Kane's expression remained unreadable, focused, wary. "Alive," he muttered, voice low. "But this doesn't end here. Someone ignored this report years ago, and I know who." The room went cold. His words carried weight. Every officer, every technician felt it, the implied reckoning for mistakes buried under layers of pride, protocol, and bureaucracy. Kane wasn't just fixing machinery. He was exposing the ghosts of the past. The young pilot who had observed him from the start stepped forward, curiosity laced with fear. "Sir, why did you leave flying?" Kane's jaw tightened. He looked out over the desert horizon, the sun casting long shadows over the tarmac. "Because I listened to jets when nobody else would. I followed warnings they ignored, and I survived missions nobody knew existed. I walked away when the system refused to learn from mistakes." He turned back to the F-16, crouching once more. His fingers traced a hidden sensor, one so small it had been dismissed in every inspection report. This nearly killed someone today," he said quietly, "because no one listened, no one cared, but it's fixable if you know where to look and what to feel." The weight of Kane's presence was suffocating. The young mechanics exchanged nervous glances, absorbing the fact that the man in front of them had survived failures that would have ended careers or lives. The senators scribbled notes furiously, unaware that they were witnessing more than a technical miracle. They were witnessing a legend returning, a master teaching instinct, vigilance, and accountability in real time. Kane stood upright, dust falling from his shoulders, sweat glinting in the sun. He didn't smile, didn't boast. He looked at the gathered crowd, and the quiet authority in his gaze was almost painful. "Remember this," he said. "Machines don't fail, people do. Pride, bureaucracy, shortcuts, they kill. This jet, she's alive because someone cared enough to listen. Most don't, most pay for it." A young technician dared a question. "Sir, how many others are like this?" Kane's gray eyes darkened. "More than you want to admit, and you'll meet them one day, maybe today, maybe tomorrow." He took a step back, brushing his hands on his pants. "For now, we watch, we learn, we fix, and we remember that the real danger isn't the machine. It's the people who forget to respect it." Even the most skeptical officers understood. This wasn't heroism. It was accountability distilled into a single figure, a man who had survived long enough to see what negligence could do and who carried the weight of that knowledge like a weapon. Kane moved toward the edge of the tarmac, toolbox in hand, ready to leave. But before he disappeared into the sun-drenched horizon, he turned once, gaze cutting through the crowd like a knife. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot. Keep your eyes open. Because I've seen what happens when pride wins over caution, and I'm not here to argue with history." As Kane's silhouette faded against the desert, whispers spread through the crowd. "Switch Kane, he's alive, he's back." The engines of the F-16 thrummed steadily behind him, a reminder that some legends never die. They linger, waiting for the moment when the system fails, and someone has to make it right. And for the men and women on that tarmac, one truth was suddenly undeniable. The F-16 had been dead, yes, but the man who brought it back to life was more dangerous, more powerful, and more legendary than anything they had ever witnessed. And no one could predict what he would do next. The roar of the F-16 engines faded into a steady hum, filling the vast expanse of the Arizona tarmac with a living, mechanical heartbeat. Ground crews stood frozen, watching in awe as the legendary Harlan switch. Kane wiped his hands on a rag, dust and grease streaking his weathered jacket. The jet's warning lights had vanished. The systems were humming cleanly, but Kane's eyes were not on the aircraft. They were on the maintenance logbook, lying open on a nearby table. The book was thick, worn, and yellowed, a layered testament to decades of work, oversight, and human error. Kane flipped through pages rapidly, eyes scanning entries, dates, and annotations as though reading a secret language. His fingers hovered over one particular page. "This one," he said, voice tight with restrained anger. He tapped the redacted entry from 2 decades prior. "Here, this report should have grounded this bird years ago." Tully, the senior chief, moved closer, hesitant. "Sir, that's old. That's before my tenure. It's—" "I know exactly what it is," Kane interrupted, his voice low but firm, slicing through the hum of the engines. "And it's why this jet nearly killed someone today. Someone ignored my warning. Back then, years ago, and they buried it." The room went cold. Engineers exchanged uneasy glances. No one dared ask the obvious question, who? Kane's gaze swept the room, landing on young mechanics who hadn't even been born when the report was filed. "Mistakes have consequences, some delayed, some lethal. Today, we almost paid for it." He flipped the pages back and forth, tracing the history of minor anomalies. An overlooked sensor here, a misaligned valve there, a faulty connection dismissed in a routine inspection. All minor, individually inconsequential but collectively deadly. The realization hit the crew like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a single oversight, it was a chain of negligence spanning decades. Kane leaned forward, pointing to a small note written in nearly illegible handwriting. "See this? Someone wrote it off as trivial. Not critical. Monitor." They monitored and forgot. "I filed the first complaint 30 minutes after takeoff that day. Nobody acted, nobody even read it." The senators in attendance shifted uneasily. This wasn't a technical demonstration anymore. This was a revelation of systemic failure. The implications were staggering: multiple aircraft, countless missions, and unreported hazards quietly hidden behind official reports. Kane closed the logbook gently, as though touching something fragile, and exhaled. "This is why I left flying," he said, voice low and haunted. "Because the system trusted paperwork over people. Because the machines were alive but the oversight dead." A young pilot, still in shock from witnessing the jet come alive under Kane's hands, dared to speak. "Sir, what happens now?" Kane's gaze cut through the group. "Now we fix it. Not just the machine, not just the valve or the sensor. We fix the record, the oversight, the chain of mistakes, and we make sure it never happens again." He rose and walked toward the F-16, crouching by the landing gear. His hands moved swiftly, almost unconsciously, checking hydraulics, sensors, and control linkages. Every movement carried authority. Every adjustment radiated knowledge that couldn't be learned from manuals. The jet responded instantly, humming with renewed vitality. This bird remembers every mission, every modification, every patch, Kane murmured. She tells you when something is wrong. Most pilots don't listen. Most techs don't listen. I do. That's the difference. The engineers watched in silence. Even Tully, grizzled by decades of service, couldn't hide his awe. Kane wasn't just repairing a jet. He was teaching them to listen. And the lesson was terrifying because it carried with it the weight of survival, accountability, and history. Then Kane's expression hardened. He stepped back and raised a hand, pointing to a section of the logbook tucked into the maintenance bay. "Look here," he said. "This section was redacted, top secret, classified, and ignored. Whoever wrote this report knew the danger, and yet nothing was done. Someone in command made a decision that put lives at risk." The room went deathly silent. The F-16, alive and alert, seemed to echo Kane's words in its steady, measured hum. This was no longer a mechanical issue. It was a moral one. "Most of you will never see a report like this in your careers," Kane continued. "You'll follow the rules, you'll check the boxes, and you'll sleep at night thinking the system works. But one day, it will fail, and the cost will be human." He crouched again, fingers skimming the engine cowling, adjusting a minor alignment only he could detect. "I've seen what happens when pride outweighs caution. I've counted the lives that slip through because someone didn't listen. This could have been one more casualty today." A young mechanic whispered, voice trembling, "Sir, did it almost kill someone?" Kane didn't flinch. "Yes, and that's why I'm here, not to fix the jet, not to be a hero, to make sure the mistakes of the past don't repeat themselves." The weight of the revelation pressed down on everyone present. No one spoke. Not the young pilots, not the engineers, not even the visiting senators. The desert heat pressed down, the jet thrummed with life, and the logbook secrets hung in the air like a warning. Finally, Kane stood upright, wiping his hands on a rag. "This is bigger than any one machine, bigger than any one mission, and it doesn't end here. This jet is just the start." He looked at Tully, senior and battle-hardened, and said quietly, "There are more like this. Jets, reports, neglect hidden by bureaucracy. I found 3 already this morning. By the end of the week, it will be obvious, and then someone's going to have to answer for it." The young pilot stepped forward, uncertainty and fear battling in his eyes. "Sir, what do we do? How do we stop it?" Kane's eyes swept the tarmac, scanning every aircraft lined up in neat rows gleaming in the sun. "We listen. We watch. We learn. Every sensor, every valve, every anomaly matters. And most importantly, we trust our instincts, not just the paperwork." He closed the logbook with deliberate care, tucking it under his arm. The hum of the F-16 seemed to pulse in agreement. Kane's shadow stretched long across the desert tarmac as he moved toward his truck. "I fixed the symptom," he said quietly, almost to himself, "but the disease, it's still here." The room remained silent. Officers, engineers, and pilots exchanged nervous glances. The magnitude of what they'd just witnessed, the brilliance, the authority, the uncompromising truth of a man who had survived the failures of the system, was almost paralyzing. Then Kane paused at the gate, glancing back. "Remember this," he said, voice carrying across the tarmac. "History has ghosts. Some of them walk among us. Listen carefully and you might survive. Ignore them and you won't." And with that, he climbed into his dusty pickup truck and drove away, leaving behind an air of tension so thick it seemed to weigh on every shoulder, every chest, every mind present. The F-16 hummed steadily, its systems fully operational, but now it was more than a machine. It was a testament to history, oversight, and the consequences of negligence. And for everyone standing there, one thought crystallized in unison. The legend of Switch Kane was not just a story. It was a warning. And the ghosts in the logbook were far from finished. The sun had begun its slow descent over Luke Air Force Base, painting the desert tarmac in streaks of orange and gold. The F-16 Kane had just revived, sat in quiet dominance, engines off now but radiating latent power. Ground crews had dispersed, still murmuring about the morning's events, while Kane leaned against the jet, wiping his hands on a rag. Dust and grease streaked his flight jacket, and his eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the lineup of aircraft, as if reading them like old friends or enemies. Commanders approached cautiously, the weight of protocol heavy in their footsteps. For hours, Kane had worked in silence, moving through the maze of warnings, valves, and logs with uncanny precision. Now, the base leadership wanted answers, explanations, and perhaps more than that, a chance to reclaim control over a man who had shattered their expectations. "Kane," said Colonel Reynolds, his voice formal but tight, "we need to talk. What you did today, it's remarkable, extraordinary even." Kane didn't immediately respond. He kept his eyes on the F-16 as if the metal beast might reveal secrets to him that it hadn't yet spoken aloud. "Remarkable," he finally said, voice low and steady. "I fixed what was broken. That's my job." The colonel stepped closer a little awkwardly. "No, sir, I mean it. You saved the jet and potentially lives. You should be commended and frankly offered a position. We want you back. Full authority your way, no questions asked. We'll make it official. Name it, rank it, anything you want." Kane let out a short, dry laugh, shaking his head. "You want me when it breaks. You didn't want me when the warnings were first filed. You didn't want me when the reports were ignored. And now you call me back." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "Sir, this is about lives. This is about preventing mistakes that could kill, surely." "I don't take orders from people who don't listen," Kane interrupted, voice sharp now, tinged with the edge of frustration he rarely allowed to show. "I left flying because the system cared more about optics than pilots. I'm not here to polish your reports. I'm here to make sure the mistakes of the past don't happen again." There was a pause. Kane's gray eyes swept over the base personnel, mechanics, pilots, and officers alike. "But I will teach," he said finally. "I'll show them what to look for, how to listen, how to respect the machines and the lives that depend on them. But there will be no cameras, no press, no speeches. This is for those who will actually survive if they pay attention." Colonel Reynolds blinked, caught off guard. "And they'll listen." "They better," Kane replied, crouching again beside the F-16. "Or someone dies. Not today maybe, tomorrow, next week. It's the same pattern every time. You ignore the subtle signs, you dismiss the anomalies, and suddenly the warnings come too late." A small group of young mechanics had stayed behind, curiosity winning over exhaustion. They watched Kane work with awe, as if observing a master sculptor shape metal with instinct and memory instead of tools. He explained things rarely written in manuals: how the jet's vibrations indicated minor alignment issues, how the hydraulic pressure shifted subtly when a valve was out of tolerance, and how overlooked sensor anomalies could cascade into catastrophic failures. "These aren't just parts," Kane said, voice carrying over the faint wind. "They're warnings. The jet speaks. Most people hear only noise. You have to listen." Hours passed. The young mechanics followed Kane from jet to jet, learning to trace vibrations, to test valves by feel, to read the hidden language of warning systems. Kane rarely spoke of his past missions, only the lessons learned: survival, vigilance, and respect. But every now and then, a fleeting shadow crossed his face, a memory of battles unrecorded, of mistakes that cost lives, of warnings ignored. By nightfall, Kane finally stood upright, brushing the dust from his hands. Colonel Reynolds approached once more, hesitation evident in his posture. "Sir, we can formalize this. Give you full access. The base, the aircraft, the training programs. Name your terms. You don't have to do this alone." Kane paused, eyes scanning the desert beyond the runway. The fatting sun cast long shadows over the planes, their polished fuselages glinting with untapped potential. He exhaled, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "No," he said simply. "They need to learn without me holding their hands. My job isn't to create heroes, it's to prevent death. And sometimes that means letting them feel the weight themselves." Colonel Reynolds opened his mouth to argue, but Kane had already turned toward his truck, tools slung over his shoulder. "Remember," Kane called over his shoulder, voice carrying across the tarmac, "the next time you hear a warning you don't like and someone tells you it's not fine. Listen, watch, learn. That's the difference between surviving and becoming a ghost in the logbook." The young mechanics exchanged nervous glances, realizing the magnitude of what they'd been entrusted to carry forward. Kane wasn't just teaching them to maintain aircraft. He was teaching them to survive, to trust instinct over protocol, to respect history as well as machinery. Hours later, the base was quiet. Kane's truck disappeared into the desert night, leaving behind the gleaming F-16s, a group of awestruck young mechanics, and a senior officer who couldn't shake the chill running down his spine. He knew, as did everyone present, that Kane had shifted the balance of their understanding. This wasn't a temporary fix, it was a revelation. Then came the alarm. Another aircraft, a different squadron, was aborting takeoff. Same warning lights, same stubborn engine indicators. Panic erupted in the hangar as personnel rushed to respond. Yet before anyone could call for assistance, a calm voice cut through the chaos. "I told you," Kane's voice echoed over the radio, distant but unmistakable. "Now listen carefully. This is what happens when warnings are ignored." Mechanics froze, pilots paled, command officers exchanged frantic glances. Kane hadn't returned physically, but his presence was undeniable. His earlier lessons had been prophetic. The system still failed where it had always failed, and now the consequences were surfacing again. Colonel Reynolds clenched his fists. "Get me Kane," he barked into the radio, but there was only static. Meanwhile, Kane, somewhere on the perimeter of the base, smiled faintly. He could hear the echo of his own lesson unfolding. Each warning ignored, each report buried, each mistake left unchecked, it all converged to this moment. And if he didn't act now, someone would pay. By the time the crew stabilized the second aircraft, Kane was already moving toward the hangar, ready to intervene, but not yet fully. He was a shadow in the night, a guardian unseen, a teacher whose presence was as much about fear as it was knowledge. The young mechanics whispered among themselves. "He's unstoppable," one said. "Not unstoppable," another corrected, voice trembling. "He's necessary and terrifying." As the night deepened, Kane's truck disappeared into the desert, leaving only dust, shadows, and the hum of jets waiting to take flight. But everyone on the base knew he would return. And when he did, the ghosts of the past, neglected, hidden, buried, would be brought into the light. Because Harlan's switch, Kane didn't just fix jets. He fixed mistakes. He exposed truth. And for anyone who underestimated the consequences of negligence, he was the living embodiment of reckoning. And somewhere in the vast desert night, another alarm began to hum, a subtle warning almost imperceptible, and Kane's smile deepened. The night was far from over. The desert sky over Luke Air Force Base had cooled into a pale violet as night deepened, but the tension on the tarmac burned hotter than the afternoon sun. Kane's F-16 stood silently in neat rows, engines off, lights dimmed. Yet the hum of potential energy in the machines felt almost alive, a whisper of warning only he seemed to hear. He moved between the jets with the deliberate calm of a predator stalking prey, scanning, touching, listening. Earlier that day, Kane had saved one aircraft. Now, as the shadows grew long, his instincts screamed that the problems didn't end there. One failure was never isolated. It was a symptom of a pattern, a chain of oversight stretching back years. And Kane, with his uncanny ability to read both machines and people, intended to trace it to its source. By midnight, he had already mapped 3 grounded aircraft, different models, different squadrons, yet sharing the same subtle, deadly flaw. Each warning had been ignored. Each minor anomaly had compounded over time, almost imperceptible until today it nearly became catastrophic. Kane crouched beside the first jet, fingers gliding over the hydraulic lines, adjustments made purely by feel. "Missed it here," he murmured. And here, same mistake as two others. Someone thought it was trivial. The young mechanics who had been chosen to stay late watched in awe, exhaustion battling their eagerness to learn. They moved silently behind him, hesitant to break the rhythm. Kane didn't lecture, didn't explain much. He demonstrated, trusting the patterns would speak for themselves. "Look," Kane said, finally breaking the silence, voice low and deliberate. "It's not a single oversight, it's not just one careless technician. This is systemic. Bureaucracy, pride, politics, they all conspire to hide flaws, and every time that happens, people pay the price. Usually pilots, sometimes civilians, sometimes both. You think a manual or a checklist will save them. You're wrong." He moved to the second aircraft, carefully testing connections that had been flagged but dismissed. "See this valve?" he asked, tapping it lightly. "It was flagged during an inspection 5 years ago, ignored, same as in the last jet, and the first jet this morning, reported, ignored. Do you see the pattern?" The young mechanic swallowed hard. "Sir, how many could be like this?" Kane's gaze was hard, almost chilling. "More than you'd want to count, and they're flying right now. Each one a potential disaster because someone didn't respect the warning signs." By 2 a.m., Kane had the young mechanics tracing, testing, and mapping every aircraft in the squadron. He taught them to read vibrations, to feel temperature differences in lines, to detect minute fluctuations in pressure, things no manual could quantify. Every small discrepancy could be a harbinger of catastrophe. Every sensor anomaly ignored was another ghost waiting to strike. Suddenly, a warning light blinked faintly on a distant F-16. The young mechanics froze. Kane's eyes sharpened. "That one," he said, voice quiet but commanding. "It's alive but hiding. Go check the logs." The mechanic ran toward the F-16, notebook in hand, heart racing. The logs told the story. A minor fuel flow anomaly, reported multiple times, dismissed each time by a series of officers who assumed it was nothing. Kane had seen enough. He strode toward the jet, moving faster than his age suggested, eyes narrowing at the subtle signs of pressure misalignment. Fingers flew across panels, readings shifted, and within minutes the jet stabilized. But not before Kane paused, eyes closing briefly, listening to the rhythm of the machine like it spoke directly to him. "This," he said softly, "could have killed a pilot today. Tomorrow it might not wait for me to notice." The young mechanics exchanged terrified glances. They had expected training. They hadn't expected lessons in life and death. The realization hit hard. The system's failures weren't abstract. They were immediate, dangerous, and human. Kane walked to the hangar and retrieved a laptop, connecting it to the fleet's monitoring system. Lines of data scrolled across the screen as he cross-referenced maintenance logs, inspection reports, and sensor readouts. Patterns emerged. Ignored anomalies, recurring warnings, failures hidden behind bureaucratic red tape. He pointed to one entry, highlighted in red. "See this? This anomaly was first reported in 99, dismissed. Reappeared in 5, ignored again. Today it almost killed someone. Do you understand the responsibility here?" The young mechanics nodded, pale and silent. Kane's gaze swept over them, piercing. "You will be the ones who listen when nobody else does. You will trace the warnings, report the anomalies, and respect what you hear. Otherwise, someone dies, and it won't be the machine." Hours passed like minutes. Kane worked tirelessly, moving between jets, logs, and technicians, mapping every flaw, tracing every failure, and teaching the young crew how to anticipate disaster before it arrived. By dawn, the desert sky was streaked with pink and gold, but Kane's focus remained unbroken. He finally stepped back, surveying the fleet. "All of you," he said, voice cutting through the morning calm, "need to understand this. Aircraft don't lie. They don't cheat. They don't ignore you. People do. If you respect the aircraft, listen to the signs, and follow instinct when the manuals fail, you might survive. Ignore them, and you're a ghost in the logbook like so many before you." Tully, senior chief, swallowed hard. "Sir, what's next? How do we fix this system?" Kane's eyes darkened, filled with both weariness and resolve. We start with the truth. No shortcuts, no politics, no reports buried in a drawer. We fix the real problems, not just the ones that make paperwork look good. And sometimes we have to do it alone. A young mechanic whispered, awestruck, "Are you going to stay?" Kane shook his head. "Not permanently. They have to learn without me holding their hands, but I will return when the system fails again. That's what legends do. They don't retire, they wait. And when the warnings start, you'll know who to listen for." At that moment, a sudden alert on one of the monitoring screens lit up. Another aircraft, this one from a different squadron, was showing the same subtle warning pattern. Kane didn't hesitate. He grabbed his toolkit and moved with the fluid precision of someone half his age, his presence alone radiating authority and urgency. "Listen carefully," he said over the intercom, voice calm yet commanding. "This isn't luck, it's pattern recognition, and if you fail to see it, someone dies. This is your life lesson." Mechanics followed him, adrenaline coursing through their veins, their training transformed into a real-world battlefield of vigilance. Kane guided them with surgical precision, teaching them how to anticipate failures, how to detect anomalies, and how to respect the silent warnings of machines that demanded attention. By sunrise, 3 additional jets had been stabilized. Each had a story of negligence, oversight, and buried warnings. Kane finally stepped back, surveying the fleet, exhaustion etched on his face but unbowed. "Remember this day," he said quietly. "Today you learn to see what others ignore. Tomorrow it may save your life or someone else." The young mechanics nodded, forever changed. Kane climbed into his dusty pickup, engine roaring to life. He paused, eyes on the lineup of aircraft. "I'll be back," he said softly. "When the system fails again, I will be back." And as the truck disappeared into the desert morning, the base personnel understood a terrifying truth. Kane's work wasn't done. The warnings hadn't stopped. They had only begun. And the man who could read the ghosts in the logbook would return to confront them, again and again. Because some legends do not retire. They wait. And when the system fails, they are the only thing standing between life and catastrophe. And somewhere hidden among the jets, another warning began to flicker. By mid-morning, Luke Air Force Base was in chaos, though no alarms were blaring. The hum of aircraft engines filled the air, but underneath the familiar rhythm of takeoffs and landings, an invisible tension gripped every officer, mechanic, and pilot on the tarmac. Kane's presence, or even the shadow of his lessons, had created a storm that could not be ignored. Colonel Reynolds paced near the operations building, phone pressed to his ear, his brow furrowed. Reports were coming in from every squadron, aircraft with unusual sensor readings, logs showing repeated anomalies ignored. Ground crews were exhausted, spread thin, and terrified that they might miss the next critical warning. The senator's delegation had been kept busy with polite tour, unaware that a single man had turned the base into a high-stakes training ground, exposing failures that spanned decades. "Sir, it's worse than we thought," Tully said quietly as he approached Reynolds. He held a tablet with maintenance logs, dozens of flagged issues, and repeated uncorrected errors. "This isn't just one jet, it's half the operational fleet, and the reports, many of them were buried, hidden, ignored." Reynolds' face paled. How did he find all of this? "Switch Kane," Tully said simply. The words carried a weight that made the colonel shiver. "He doesn't just fix jets. He sees through the bureaucracy, the negligence, the lies, and he makes people pay attention. Right now he's out there and no one knows which jet will fail next." Meanwhile, Kane moved with unrelenting precision across the base, addressing each aircraft that had shown warning anomalies. Mechanics followed, their movements nervous but attentive. Kane didn't speak more than a few words at a time, but every instruction carried clarity and authority. "Check this valve, test this sensor, watch the vibration pattern here." Each motion was a lesson in vigilance, a testament to decades of experience, and an unspoken warning of what would happen if the chain of errors went unchecked. One young pilot, barely 23, watched Kane adjust the hydraulics on a barely used jet. "Sir, do you ever sleep?" he asked. Kane didn't look up. "Sleep doesn't fix mistakes," he said softly. "Attention does, instinct does, and pride kills." By late afternoon, word of Kane's actions had reached the highest levels. Military leadership was demanding accountability. The base command was being pressed to produce answers for the senators, who now wanted briefings on the operational safety of the fleet. Every senior officer was aware that Kane's work was both miraculous and damning. He had revealed the skeletons hidden in maintenance logs, mistakes that had been ignored because nobody wanted to confront systemic failures. And then the phone calls started. "Colonel Reynolds," said one voice on the secure line, "do you realize what this could mean? Investigations, public scrutiny, even potential criminal liability for ignored warnings." Reynolds ran a hand over his face. "We know, but Kane, he's saving lives. Half the fleet would be grounded indefinitely if we relied on the old checks, and if we don't act quickly, more failures could occur before anyone can respond." Back on the tarmac, Kane crouched beside another F-16, tracing microfractures in a hydraulic line, tracing vibrations, adjusting sensors, all with the quiet focus of a man who had seen too many near-death moments to waste time on hesitation. A senior technician whispered to a junior, "He's unstoppable." "No," the junior whispered back, awe in his voice. "He's necessary and terrifying." Kane's voice cut through the quiet. "You have to learn to anticipate failure before it arrives. Machines don't lie, people do. Read the signs, listen, respect history. If you ignore it, someone dies, and it could be you." The base's operations room buzzed with frantic energy. Logs, spreadsheets, sensor readouts, all the evidence of ignored warnings were being compiled in real time. Investigations were being launched, and senior officers were forced to confront a truth that had been hidden in plain sight. Decades of negligence, minor errors dismissed repeatedly, and a culture that valued appearances over safety. Kane's shadow loomed over all of it. He wasn't officially in charge. He didn't hold rank here, but the way he moved, the way he corrected mistakes, and the absolute certainty of his expertise left no one daring to question him. His authority was not institutional, it was instinctual, earned over decades where mistakes had cost lives. By evening, the base's entire operational fleet had been inspected under Kane's guidance. Several minor issues were corrected on the spot. More serious problems were flagged for immediate attention. Kane had single-handedly prevented what could have been a catastrophic chain of failures, but the tension didn't lift. Colonel Reynolds approached him as Kane was walking toward his truck. "Sir, I need to know, will you accept a permanent position here, full authority, whatever you ask?" Kane's gray eyes met Reynolds. "I don't want authority, I don't want rank, I don't want paperwork, I want people to learn to listen. And they will or they won't. If they fail, they'll learn the hard way. That's all the authority I need." The colonel swallowed hard, realizing that Kane's presence was both a blessing and a warning. The man didn't operate within the normal chain of command. He operated above it, guided by instinct and experience no report could quantify, and that made him terrifyingly effective. As night fell completely, a single aircraft's warning light blinked faintly on the far side of the base. A young pilot froze. Kane's voice came over the radio, calm but sharp. "That's your next lesson. Pay attention, don't ignore it, don't let it be dismissed. Move now." Mechanics rushed, following the subtle cues Kane had taught them throughout the day. They worked faster, smarter, anticipating potential failures rather than reacting. Kane's shadow remained over their work, a constant reminder that the consequences of negligence were real, immediate, and deadly. By midnight, the base had stabilized. Investigations were underway, logs had been corrected, and a new culture of vigilance was taking root. Kane stepped back, surveying the fleet. Exhaustion lined his face, but his posture remained unbowed, a sentinel in the desert night. "Remember this," he said softly, voice carrying across the quiet tarmac. "Machines remember, people forget. Listen carefully. Anticipate the unseen. Respect what you cannot control. And maybe, just maybe, you survive." He climbed into his dusty truck and drove toward the perimeter road. Behind him, the base was buzzing with life and unease, knowing that the reckoning had only begun. Kane's work had revealed a hidden truth. The danger wasn't gone. It had only been exposed. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another warning light blinked faintly, and Kane's smile, just a hint in the darkness, suggested that the night was far from over. Because some legends don't rest. They wait. And when the ghosts of negligence rise again, they are the only ones standing between survival and disaster. And Luke Air Force Base would never be the same. The desert sky over Luke Air Force Base was a deep, endless black, speckled with stars. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of night shift maintenance vehicles and the occasional wind that swept across the tarmac. Kane stood alone by the lineup of F-16s, eyes scanning each jet with meticulous care, tracing invisible patterns with the instincts of a man who had survived decades where mistakes meant death. Tonight was different. Kane felt it, a presence in the machines, subtle but undeniable. He had fixed what he could in the daylight hours, trained the young mechanics to anticipate failure, and exposed the decades-long pattern of negligence that had haunted the base. But now, under the moonlight, the last anomaly called to him. A faint blinking on the far side of the runway, a jet in the third row drew his attention. The indicators were subtle, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but Kane's instincts, honed over countless missions, sensed danger. That subtle pattern, the irregular vibration, the faint hydraulic fluctuation, told him the story. This jet had been ignored for years, buried deep in a logbook no one had read. He approached quickly, toolbox slung over his shoulder. Mechanics who had stayed late followed, their flashlights trembling as they caught glimpses of Kane's calm, commanding figure. The jet's sensors flickered erratically, almost in protest, and Kane crouched beside the landing gear, listening to the heartbeat of the machine like a doctor diagnosing a patient on the brink of death. "This one," Kane muttered, fingers dancing over panels, adjusting valves, testing circuits, reading vibrations. "This is the one they thought they could forget. But it doesn't forget. Machines remember." The young mechanics gasped as Kane worked with precision that bordered on supernatural. There was no hesitation, no error, only the fluid rhythm of decades of experience. He traced connections, measured pressures, and adjusted hydraulics in ways that no manual had ever prescribed. Every move was a conversation with the jet, and the jet responded instantly. "Sir, is it going to be okay?" one young pilot asked, voice trembling. Kane didn't look up. "It will be," he said quietly, but his tone carried the weight of absolute certainty. "But if you don't understand the lessons, it won't. That's why I'm here. To teach you to see the unseen before it kills." Hours passed in tense silence. Sweat ran down Kane's face, hands blackened with grease, but he didn't stop. He traced microfractures invisible to the naked eye, corrected sensor misalignments that had gone unnoticed for years, and recalibrated every system that could pose even the slightest risk. Each adjustment was precise, deliberate, and crucial. Finally, he leaned back, exhausted but triumphant. The F-16 system stabilized, sensors all green, vibrations normal, warnings gone. Kane exhaled, his gray eyes scanning the horizon. "Alive," he murmured, voice almost reverent. "And no one had to die tonight." The young mechanics stood in awe. They had seen the impossible, one man, alone, defying what seemed unfixable, navigating decades of errors to prevent catastrophe. The legend of Switch Kane had become reality. Colonel Reynolds arrived, accompanied by several senior officers. "Kane," he began, voice tight with disbelief and admiration, "you've done more than we could have imagined. Entire squadron saved. Lives protected, systems corrected, you've changed everything. Kane shook his head. I didn't change anything permanent, he said softly. I just showed them the truth. The system has to work on its own. If they fail to listen, I can't always be here to fix it. Reynolds stepped closer. And the base, the fleet, the future of these pilots. You've already seen it, Kane said, eyes sweeping the lineup of jets gleaming under the moonlight. I've taught them to anticipate failure, to respect the machines, and to never ignore a warning. That's the difference between survival and death. And if they carry that forward, maybe the system works again. Suddenly, a soft alarm blared from the last jet Kane had repaired. It wasn't critical, but it was enough to catch the attention of everyone nearby. Kane moved instantly, checking sensors and systems. It was minor, a last anomaly overlooked in the chaos, but he treated it with the same vigilance as the most critical failure. This is the lesson they must never forget, he said quietly. Every warning matters. Every small failure has a story. You ignore it at your peril. Hours later, the base was finally calm. Kane's work was done, for now. Pilots, mechanics, and officers moved about with a newfound respect for the machines they served, and for the man who had reminded them of the cost of negligence. Stories of the day's events spread through the base like wildfire. Kane's legend solidified in real time. Reynolds approached Kane one last time. Sir, will you stay? Lead training. We can make it official, give you authority, resources, everything you need to protect this fleet permanently. Kane's gaze met the colonel's, gray eyes deep and unwavering. I'm not here to hold a title, he said. I'm here to show them what to see, what to hear, what to respect. They'll either learn or they won't, and if they fail, I'll come back. That's enough authority for me. He climbed into his truck, tools packed, dust settling from the night's work. As he drove toward the horizon, the moonlight reflecting off the F-16s behind him, the base personnel felt a strange combination of relief and awe. Kane had fixed what no one else could, revealed the patterns of systemic failure, and left a lesson that would echo for years to come. The young mechanics, still exhausted and in disbelief, exchanged glances. Do you think he'll ever retire? One whispered. Not a chance, another replied. He's not just a pilot or a technician, he's a force of nature. He's the warning itself. As Kane's truck disappeared into the desert night, a soft hum came from one of the jets, almost imperceptible but distinct to those who knew how to listen. It was the heartbeat of a machine, alive and ready. The message was clear. The work wasn't over. There would always be warnings, always be ghosts in the logbook, always be someone who had to see what others ignored. And somewhere in the distance, a new alarm blinked faintly. Kane didn't flinch. He had survived decades of mistakes, disasters, and oversight. He had faced the system itself and emerged unbowed. And as long as danger existed, he would return. Because legends don't fade, they wait, they watch, and they act when no one else dares. Luke Air Force Base would never forget the night when the F-16s, once dead on the tarmac, were brought back to life by a man who refused to ignore the ghosts of the past. And the desert night whispered the final truth to everyone who had witnessed it. Harlan's switch Kane was alive, he was back, and he would always be listening.